Hey, awesome people. Reverend Derek Terry here. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, YouTube, TikTok at Rev Derek Terry. Thank you so much for your patronage. I'm really excited. Excited to be on this journey with you towards teaching and exploring the ideas of race and social justice. This month, we're looking at the idea of the revolutionary Dr. King. I'm annoyed that it's common for even the most conservative thinkers and politicians to quote Dr. Martin Luther King in very filtered lens. And they usually do it in ways and say things like, well, if Dr. King was around, he wouldn't like this or he wouldn't like that. He wouldn't support Black Lives Matters because that divides us. And he wouldn't support groups like Until Freedom because that divides us. And they quote him by mentioning the I Have a Dream speech a lot, being judged by the color of your or content of your character versus the color of your skin. And I don't see color. And the more people say stuff like that, the more obvious it is to me that they really didn't know King, that they didn't study him, that they didn't read his writings, that they have a very superficial, very simple idea of Martin Luther King. They may know the bus boycott. They absolutely know March on Washington. They know he died too soon. And they know the idea that we have a king of King now. But it bothers me because that's a false narrative. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, April 4th, he was one of the most hated people in this country. He was misunderstood by many Black Americans. He was hated by many white Americans. And so this month, I really want to explore who King was. Give you a really good foundation of the revolutionary, of the other side of King, of beyond those words, I have a dream. I want to explore and look at those resources and how he weaponized nonviolence, and listen to some of the stuff that he talked about, not only as it relates to racial inequity, but social and financial inequality. And yeah, I'm super excited about that. I want you to, of course, learn more on your own and ask me questions. We'll go on this journey together, and I'm super excited. I'm super excited that you have decided to invest in this way, and I look forward to doing this work with you. Today's work, we're going to go back in time. We're going to go back in time to Sunday, March 31st, 1968, less than 100 hours before the assassination of Martin Luther King. And at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., King delivered his very last Sunday sermon, just a very few days before he was killed in Memphis. Let's first start with King's America. Understand the America of 1968. 1968 was a crazy time, not just because of the assassination of King, and later that year, Bobby Kennedy and the crazy Democratic National Convention, but there was a lot going on in the country in 1968. We were in the middle of a war that was not quite so unpopular as it would become to be in history, the Vietnam War. In 1968, King's popularity was very unfavorable. In 1963, Gallup poll indicated that about 40% of America had an unfavorable view of King. By 1966, about 66% of the country, so 2/3 of the country, had an unfavorable view of King, according to the Newsweek article from 2018. His popularity began to wane After he won the Nobel Prize in 1964, and that happened for several reasons. One, King was gaining momentum, right? And so people, okay, that's an Alabama thing. Oh, okay, that's a Southern thing. Well, he started to expand into other ideas in other areas. That him earning the Nobel Prize really set those in the federal government against him. J. Edgar Hoover is on record as saying he's the most, dangerous Negro in the country because of his ability to charm and get other people to follow him. And now he's got all this international fame and people are on his side, and so that's part of the popularity goes down because the federal government in the United States, under the leadership of the FBI, with the approval of Presidents Kennedy at first, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, and then eventually President Johnson, we're looking into King. We're doing lots of stuff to undermine the movement, undermine the organizations, putting bad press, putting some negative stuff out there. One of the biggest problems that King, when we talk about King's America at the time he was giving this speech, was on April 4th, 1967, literally 1 year to the day before he was assassinated. King gave a now famous speech or sermon at the Riverside Church in New York, where he unapologetically and boldly denounced the America's involvement in the war in very strong and very fiery language. And Johnson was pissed. President Johnson was pissed by that. So you have, already this momentum of people, kind of getting agitated with King, and even some of the black leaders kind of getting agitated with King because, of what he was doing in the movement, and there's maybe some jealousy. And then President Johnson was pissed and had felt betrayed. He's the Southern, he's from the South. He literally, I was quoted as saying that, with the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that Democrats have lost the South for the next 50 years. So all that political capital that he gave to get these legislations passed, and he felt betrayed by King because, he spoke out against the government, spoke out against this war that Johnson was leading us through. So after that speech, Riverside Church, that very last year of King's life, it had to be miserable for him. Johnson, pulled back, and Hoover, director of the FBI, had an all-out war against King, hatred, trying to find ways to embarrass him and all that good stuff. Civil rights leaders who had been friends of King for years, all of a sudden felt that political move hurt the movement for civil rights. And, if there's going to be a peace movement, there's going to be a civil rights movement. King had chosen the peace movement and neglected the civil rights movement. So friends of his literally publicly denounced him on television, in the press. So yeah, this is not a great time for King. That speech against the Vietnam War hurt him politically, and it hurt his standing in the black community. Something that's less talked about, that I bring up here on purpose, especially as a minister, is the all-out war that the federal government had against Dr. King. They were actively working to hurt and discredit him. The FBI, under the full knowledge of the executive branch, not only were trying to undermine King as a leader, but were trying to attack him psychologically. Recent FBI files that were released showed that the Bureau, had audio tapes and proof, perhaps pictures, of King in sexual relationships with women that were not his wife and use those audio tapes and use pressure to release them and to release that information, to apply psychological pressure, sending copies of those to the press, to his wife, staffers, to other black church leaders, sending him a document basically saying you should probably kill yourself because, once this gets out, this is going to be terrible. So again, I'm talking about, what was going on in King's mind, in King's world at this time. So imagine, the weight of the world is on your shoulders. You're constantly worried about threats of violence. Who can you trust? Wiretaps, all that type of stuff. You're raising money for the movement. You're constantly working. You're constantly traveling. You're not seeing your family a lot. You're losing friends. You're losing community standing. Stress. He was always in the hospital, just worn out. Exhaustion is what they would call it, and strain. And in the middle of all that, he had a fear that his sex life, his deepest secrets would be exposed, and yet he continued to preach. He continued to do this work, knowing that at any time he could be greatly embarrassed his organization, greatly embarrassed his wife, their children. That's a lot. That's a lot. But he stood in the pulpit of the National Cathedral and preached a sermon in the tradition of the black church sermons, right? I mean, he preached a sermon not with the same fiery electricity that he would in perhaps a more, southern or more black setting, but with the same passion and fervor that he always presented. He was just an amazing speaker. The weight of the world on his shoulders, 100 hours, actually fewer than 100 hours away from his own assassination. And yet he stood and he read a scripture from Revelations. Behold, I make all things new, former things are passed away. He starts with a story of Rip Van Winkle, who slept through a revolution. He paints us an image of how when Rip went to sleep, King George was in charge. When he woke up 20 years later, George Washington was in charge. He had slept through a revolution. And he then goes on to talk about the triple revolution that the country was in at that time. He actually quoted a document, a dossier. In March 1964, the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions published a document called the Triple Revolution. It was an open memo to President Johnson about all the revolutions that were taking place at that time in that first half of the 1960s. And King quoted directly from that document when he talked about those revolutions. In a sense, he says, it is a triple revolution, that is a technological revolution with the impact of automation and cybernation. Then there was a revolution in weaponry with the emergence of the atomic and nuclear weapons of warfare. Then there is the human rights revolution with the freedom explosion that is taking place all over the world. Yes, we do live in a period where changes are taking place, and yes, there is still the voice crying out through the vista of time saying, behold, I make all things new. Former things are passed away. Now, whenever anything new comes into history, it brings with it new challenges and new opportunities. And I would like to deal with the challenges we face today as a result of this triple revolution that is taking place in the world today. One of the things you should definitely do if you are actively going through these topics with me is in your journal, look at some of the challenges that were taking place in 1967 and compare them with some of the challenges taking place in 2021. And we got some doozies. I mean, literally, the 6th day of 2021, it was just crazy at the Capitol. Like, there's a lot going on. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And what are those challenges that we face? What are the revolutions of today? Technology, internet, automation, that The technology was different 50 years ago, but guess what? Technology, electric cars. People talk about people coming from other countries and stealing our jobs. Automation is stealing more jobs. A computer is more likely to steal a job than someone from Mexico. That's just the reality. Cyber currency, cyber security, the way we shop. In the pandemic, we've seen how we shop, how we grocery shop. I probably will never or rarely go back to the grocery store. It is so convenient to have groceries delivered, or so convenient to pull up, call someone, and they bring them out to your car. The logistics of all of those things. Think of the shrinking middle class, right? In the 1960s, you could have a good factory job, good benefits, and didn't have to have a college education to do so, and good union jobs. And a lot of those are now shrinking. A lot of people, even with lots of college education, because they cost so much, can't live a decent middle class life. Think about the environment, climate change, right? All this type of stuff that's going on with our world right now. More urbanization, right? More people are leaving rural America, going to urban centers. Greater population, right? It's a much larger population now than in 1968 when King was assassinated. It was about 200 million Americans then. We have about 330 million Americans now. And so what is the backdrop, in other words? What are the challenges that we face today? What would that report look like today? And that's important because how all those things touch black people, touch brown people, touch poor people, helps us in our work to understand and to fight for race and social justice work. King's sermon had four main points, four main challenges, and that's typical in a black sermon. Introduction, that was Rip Van Winkle. Then here's the meat, where you compare that to what's going on in the text, and then some type of illustration to bring it on home, and then a charge, what you do from there. And so 4 challenges. The first challenge, King said, first we are challenged to develop a world perspective. No individual can live alone. And he talks about the world being geographically one. And that's something that we still face today. Think about that. Humanity. We're geographically one. What happens in one country, in one place, even if it's all the way around across the world, when you look at climate change and jet streams and how that works, humanitarian crises, how that affects all of us. We are all connected. Think about that in your journal. What are the ways we are connected? What about COVID? Didn't COVID show us that COVID is no respecter of persons, right? Doesn't matter where you live. If we're all staying at home, we all have those same, some of those same issues. It's a really good example. What about the opioid crisis, right? It affects rich and poor alike, city and rural alike. What are the other issues that show our interconnectedness? King says we must learn all to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in the inescapable network of mutuality, and whatever affects one affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it is structured. So consider those things. Think about those things. What are the ways that we are all connected, and why is that important? It's important because in our work, when we're doing this work, we will find ourselves having to explain to people why it matters, why race, why social justice, why class and income inequality is not just the marginalized or the oppressed people's problem. But if one of us suffers, if one of us is starving, if one of us doesn't have water, if one of us, it impacts the rest of us, but by the grace of God, that can be us or our people. And human suffering is not something we should simply ignore, right? Okay, I'm not preaching, but I'm just saying, we have to think about that, and that's why it's important. Second challenge that King gives us is, he says, secondly, we are challenged to eradicate the last vestiges of racial injustice from our nation. I must say this morning that racial injustice is still the black man's burden and the white man's shame. Just what I was saying. We tend to look at race in our country as, well, this is their problem. This is the black people's problem. One of my favorite lines from a speech that I gave 2 years ago, it's on here. I gave it, it's a MLK Day speech, and it's based on a scripture from Deuteronomy. And I talk about cleaning up messes. And people say, well, it's not my job. No one alive today was ever a slave, and no one alive today ever owned slaves. But you see, beloved, we occupy buildings that were built by slaves. We have institutions and colleges and government buildings that literally have the blood, sweat, and tears of chattel humans in the mortar, in the bricks. And so since we still occupy those buildings, since we still walk on land that was planted and tilled by slaves, we must clean up messes that we did not make, because we drink from wells that we did not dig, and we eat from trees that we did not plant. And that's why we have to do it. We can't just accept all the benefits but ignore the work that is required, or the ugliness. And so we have to eradicate it. And it's not just black people's problems, it's everybody's problems. It's not just legislature's problems, but it's individual people's problems. And it's not just the government's problem, but it's also the business. They have a responsibility as well. Martin Luther King said this way: something positive must be done. Everyone must share in the guilt, as individuals and as institutions. The government must certainly share with the guilt. Individuals must share the guilt. Even the church must share the guilt. The hour has come for everybody, all institutions of the public and private sector, to work to get rid of racism. And now, if we are to do it, we must honestly admit certain things and get rid of certain myths that have constantly been disseminated all over our nation. And he gives two myths. One, the myth of time. In other words, we should just wait. And that's when I get really pissed with lots of people, especially people who call themselves conservative. It's wait. Everything is wait. Wait for everything except for cutting taxes, right? Okay, that's political. Sometimes I get political. You're following me, you're patronizing me, so you'll understand that. But Martin Luther King tells us that time is neutral. It can be used constructively or destructively. And he reminds us that those on the other side of justice do a much better job with time than we do, which is why they want us to wait. And so that's myth number one. If we're going to get rid of these vestiges of racial injustice, we have to stop waiting and start working. The second myth, he says, is an over-reliance on the bootstrap philosophy. That whole idea that you should just pick yourselves up by your own bootstraps. But he goes on to say, how can you tell that to some group of people who were for 240 years slaves, for 100 years under the laws of Jim Crow, and with very little help or assistance say, okay, go do it. And these are the very same people who say that, I'm paraphrasing, very same people who say that are the people who were given land to undergird the economic floor of white peasants from Europe. Understand, those are the people who came from Europe. European immigrants initially to this country. They were poor, and they were given land, and colleges were built to help them to work to take care of the land, and county agents helped to give them the technology, and the very people who benefited from all that government assistance for generations. They built wealth and were able to leave it, and land and were able to leave it and build generational wealth. Now tell, as King says, quote, and these are so often the very people who tell the Negroes that they must lift themselves up by their own bootstraps. It's all right to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself up by his own bootstraps. This is the time of the 60s, inclusive language wasn't there, and just for the sake of the work, I'm not going to. Sometimes I will correct that gender specific language, but just to keep with the flow, I won't. But don't think that I'm ignorant to that. And we do the same thing today, right? King says a cruel jest to say to a bootless man they ought to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps. How many times did we see during COVID talking about poor people who didn't have savings? Well, they should save, they should have savings. Well, you don't make any money. You don't want people to have $15 an hour, right? You don't want people to have a living wage. And the cost of rent has not kept up with wage growth. And so what do you say? I mean, most poor people, if you don't know anybody poor people routinely don't earn enough money to pay all their bills every month. So this month the water bill gets paid and the light and gas bill is late. So then next month pay the light and gas bill, but then the water bill doesn't get paid, and you're constantly paying the past due amount because you don't have it. And you're constantly juggling and working and making payment arrangements. But pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. So what do you do if you don't have any boots? What are the myths? What other myths are there today? I mean, we saw millionaire senators argue for a year over whether or not poor people get $600 one time. It's ridiculous. What are the myths? Write them in your journal. What are those myths? Because those are the things that we're going to have to identify and push back against in order to get rid of these last vestiges that are still here, still with us. The third challenge team talked about is the major issue, another major issue that we're still plagued with, and that's the issue of poverty. He said, quote, I will remind you that in our own nation, there are about 40 million people who are poverty stricken. This is 1968. The estimate was 40 million. 2019, the estimate is 43 million. 43.96 million. So almost 44 million. Now, that's more, but the actual rate is less because the population then was 200 million. The population now is 330 million. So that ratio, that 40 million out of 200, is greater than 43 million out of 330, but that's still 43 million families, 43 million households, 43 million sets of, how many children are in there, right? How many people are food insecure in there? How many people don't have the medicine that they need in there, right? These are people, these are individuals, these are humans. And he talks about the squalor with which people live. King, the son of a middle-class black preacher, King, who dressed well, had a gold Rolex watch, but he understood and he knew poverty. Why? Because he went and he traveled. In 1966, King moved into the slums of Chicago to understand, to see, and to realize what was happening in the country with poor people and the rats and the roaches and the lead poisoning, and how society had forgotten about them. And he was highlighting the nation's treatment of the poor with his Chicago campaign, and with the goals of ending slums and segregation, because King knew that poverty was one of the most grotesque shames of our country. And those 40 million people who are impoverished are too often forgotten, are too often ignored. And so, debated about this because, but anyway, I think it's important to bring up here. King does what a preacher does, and he uses an illustration from Jesus to talk about Dives. And he tells a story, or the parable of a man named Dives. It's in the Bible, who was rich, and there was a man named Lazarus who was poor. And this is quoting King directly. But not only was he poor, he was sick. Sores were all over his body, and he was so weak that he could hardly move. But he managed to get to the gate of Dives every day, wanting just to have the crumbs that would fall off his table. And Dives said nothing about it. And the parable ends saying that Dives went to hell, and there were a fixed gulf now between Lazarus and Dives. Jesus never made a universal indictment against all wealth. Dives didn't go to hell, King said, because he was rich. Dives didn't go to hell. Dives didn't realize, rather, that his wealth was his opportunity. It was his opportunity to bridge the gulf that separated him from his brother Lazarus. Dives went to hell because he was passed by Lazarus every day, and he never really saw him. He went to hell because he allowed his brother to become invisible. Dives went to hell because he maximized the minimum and minimized the maximum. Indeed, Dives went to hell because he sought to be a conscientious objector in the war against poverty. And so he goes on to talk about the question facing the nation today. And it's the idea of, are we doing enough for the poor? And in 2021, are we doing enough for the poor? No. Well, people are quick to say, well, Jesus said the poor is always with us. Well, yeah, that don't mean you just let them sit there and starve. Let them go without. What are we doing? And we keep getting cuts and breaks to rich people, and rich people complaining, $15 an hour is too much, as they get on private jets and go to $100 million homes and own islands. This is ridiculous. There is enough money in our country to take care of poor people, to help poor people, to offer them an economic floor, an opportunity. Dives didn't go to hell because he was rich. Dives went to hell because he was passed by Lazarus every day, but never really saw him. His wealth was his opportunity. The fourth and final challenge that King addressed was his anti-war stance. We're in the middle of Vietnam. King was before his time as it related to Vietnam, but it's related to a lot of things. But he was one of the first major political leaders to speak out against Vietnam, and he paid a huge price for it. Because, this is the generation that had seen loved ones serve in World War II, completely different war, and saw a country band together and plant gardens and ration stockings and do all this stuff in the name of defeating Hitler. In King's speech at Riverside, he said, how different is America? They're trying out these chemical weapons against the Viet Cong and innocent children the same way that Hitler tried weapons in World War II. I mean, he was out there in his anti-war speech, or the anti-war portion of his speech was a lot, in this last speech, was a lot less fiery than the one he delivered at Riverside. But he was just as passionate when he quoted Kennedy saying, "Mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind." People told him, "You shouldn't talk about this. You shouldn't get on the other side of Johnson." But King told Johnson, President Johnson, "I can count. And the money that you talk about setting aside for the Poor People's Campaign is being used to build bombs and drop bombs in Vietnam." And he went on to talk about that and to really charge America to think about what it was doing in its war. And we really, really, really have to understand that he was right about Vietnam. And a prophet in the wilderness, he spoke it, and people were pissed about it. And what about war today? How many countless wars? We talk about how much money stimulus costs. How much money have we spent on a never-ending war? How much money have we spent on bombs? We keep building military. But what about building community, building people right here? He closes with what every black preacher would close with: a charge. Charge is, what do you do? What do you go? What do you take with you? What is that inspirational moment? And he said, "Let me close by saying that we have difficult days ahead in the struggle for justice and peace, but I will not yield to a politic of despair. I'm going to maintain hope as we come to Washington in this campaign." He was planning the Poor People's Campaign. They were going to go to Washington. It didn't matter about what color you were. Why? Because in this country, if you're poor, you can be black, you can be brown, you can be white. In Eastern Kentucky, you were struggling. And so King was trying to get all the poor people in the country together to come and fight for a redistribution of America's wealth. And as you might imagine, that did not make him very popular, especially with wealthy people, especially with business, right? So, he says we're going to maintain hope as we come to Washington in this campaign. I say to you that our goal is freedom. And I believe we are going to get there, because however much she strays from it, the goal of America is freedom. And America does stray from it. Abused and scorned though we may be, as a people, our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They were slaves. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most humiliating and oppressive conditions. And yet, out of the bottomless vitality, they continued to grow and developed. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we face now will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom, because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so, however dark it is, however deep the angry feelings are, and however violent explosions are, I can still sing, "We shall overcome." With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair the stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. God grant that we will be participants in this newness and this magnificent development. If we will but do it, we will bring about a new day of justice and brotherhood and peace. And that day, the morning stars will sing together, and the sons of God will shout for joy. God bless you. That's the charge. We're fighting for this, and we're going to win because we're right. Because we're on the side of right now. Right is one of those things. Usually both sides thinks they're right, honey. Both sides thinks they're right. And sometimes there's some truth. Multiple things can be true. But then there's justice. If we in this country say that all people are created equal and are endowed by a creator with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then certain things are true. When I look at pictures of people protesting 50, 60 years ago, and they're holding up segregation supporting signs, history has proved them wrong. They thought they were right, but they were wrong. They were on the wrong side of justice. And so we have to constantly ask ourselves, is what I'm saying right? Am I just protecting my interests, my position? So what's right? If you're here because you want to fight for what you believe to be right. You want to stand for the marginalized and the oppressed populations of our world. And that's what we have to do. In this very speech, King said, the time is always ripe, R-I-P-E, to do what is right, R-I-G-H-T. We must come to see that the roots of racism are deep in our country, and there must be something positive and massive in order to get rid of all the effects of racism and the tragedies of racial injustice. We've been around for a long time. And the idea of America is beautiful. Where people are created equal, where there's liberty and justice for all. But unfortunately, the idea does not match the actuality. And so, what we must do is we must work. We must do our part. Watch the speech if you haven't. I think it's easier if you watch this video first, then watch the speech, because pick up on stuff and then get stuff going. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you feel. Hit me up. I'm very approachable. Thank you so much for all the various levels of patronage. Love you. Follow me on social media, not just here, but social media: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok at Rev Derek Terry. Take care. God bless. Peace.